So you just went ahead and changed your product without even thinking about it, without testing it, put it on the market, and then you're surprised because your sales went down. And that is where human factors comes in.
Welcome to the Medical Sales Accelerator Podcast. I'm Zed Williamson.
And I'm Clark Wiederhold.
This podcast exists to put scale to the value you get from those great one-to-one conversations at conferences and sales meetings.
Human factors. Is it a means to an end or a competitive advantage?
And that's why we're speaking with our guest today, Heidi Mehrzad. She is CEO of HFUX Research. Heidi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Heidi, I have zero doubt that everybody listening to this podcast, when we're done, is going to have felt the impact of the work that you and your organization do with companies. But to kick us off, for folks that don't quite know what the term human factor means, can you give us a description of the science and how it rolls into early stage development?
Yeah, sure. So human factors comes out of the field of applied experimental psychology. So it is basically, if you want to really dwindle it down, it's like psychology engineering. You apply the things we know about humans with their performance limitations, with their knowledge skills, with their abilities to the engineering of things. Most effectively in the realm of medical device development, it is in relation to the interaction between the user and the interface of the device, right? And when I say interface, that doesn't mean it needs to have like an LED screen. It's just an interface, can be just a handle, can be a button, can be anything. Interface can actually just be a picture on something, meaning a label. So a label on a device can just be an interface. And that is what we specifically look into. We are a part of the R&D process of medical device development. So we are involved in the research and the design and the development and the testing, meaning verification and validation, within the R&D process of medical device development.
And when you think about what you do for companies,
Right.
What I want to make clear is companies don't get to skip this step. It's part of the regulatory process. But what you're witnessing is that many times it's thought of a little bit farther down the road that it should be. Am I off base with that thought?
No, you're right on the money. We are unfortunately still a little bit of an afterthought. Afterthought, I use that term because it often comes up, as you said, there's a regulatory requirement attached to us, right? When I say us, I mean the science, but to human factors, there's a regulatory component. We are required, there is a required human factors portion of your submission for FDA approval. And that can be any approval. So 510K, de novo, PMA, like it doesn't matter. There is a portion of it. And depending on what your device is and how your device is evaluated and reviewed from an aspect of a lot of things, the safe and effective component comes in. So human factors engineering within your medical device development process basically is a risk-based approach to the design and development of your product, from the input and the involvement of the end user. So at the end of your process, when you're going through design validation, our job is to validate the interface according to its use risks, which then are considered in your residual risk analysis. And that allows you to do your benefits risks statement and analysis, and that will basically render you to conclude that your device is safe and effective. And those words are the most critical thing. Now, because we are so heavily represented in the design validation and the validation process, which is later in development, at the end actually, before you go to clinical trial, it often is thought as an afterthought. So development takes off, people sit down, they think about the requirements of the product, they think about product specifications, they think about all these things, right? They do their device risk analyses, they do their materials, anything and everything that has to do with development, engineering, search on that side. But then when it comes to human factors, it's often kind of overlooked as because the engineers or the group that is developing it will look at it and say, okay, well, once we get to this stage, once we get to that stage, this is fine, this works. And there's lots of other issues that come up in development, obviously, right? You don't always hit it out of the park, right? So it goes through iterations. And in those iterations is when we become critical, but are all often overseen, overlooked, or not implemented. So where we often come up is in this like very late stage before validation, and then the manufacturer or the developer will think of, okay, well, this is where we should do like a usability test. And I'm air quoting it for the people who are not watching a video. We'll do like usability testing in air quotes. And then they'll do like one usability test, and then they're like, oh, okay, let's move on to validation. But what they're failing to see are all the issues that are now coming up because you never had an end user involved. And that is where it gets murky, because now you already have a product that is heading down the road with certain things like nobody wants to change. You've struggled to get this in place and you struggle to get that to work, and nobody wants to change this. And so that's why I say like we often become an afterthought, because at that point we're already almost too late to have any kind of natural or beneficial impact, right? Now it's really forced. Now human factors becomes the enemy of making your deadlines.
Right.
Now human
it's a
factors
to getting.
Yes. And now like we're a barrier, now we're a negative component, and now we're not seen as an advantage.
What's interesting is I bet that there might be one or two medical device sales reps out in the world who might have an opinion on the usability of their device because of what they see in the OR. And this is exactly what we're talking about. It gets pushed through. It's a brilliant idea. We're solving problems. Let's get it to market. Oh, we forgot a human has to use it. Well, we'll figure it out. Just get out there, rock and roll. So it feels like what you're talking about is that's an outcome of using human factors as a stamp of approval when everything's almost done. Almost like if you get your house inspected and all the electrical's in, and you get the electrical inspection goes, yeah, you're pretty good. Okay. You're not redoing everything. And it feels like it's the same scenario where if you were brought in earlier and they could develop the device with that end user more in mind, that we'd have some better outcomes.
100%. I mean, you kind of already summarized it right there, but it's not just, I think it's also critical to say it's not just the OR, right? It can be as simple as a
stethoscope, right? Or anything.
No, it can be as simple as a pre-filled syringe that you take home, right? Is the home user going to dose themselves correctly, right? Like that's as simple as it is right there. That's the simplest I can think of when it comes to the lay user, right? But you can also think of over the counter. I don't want to get into over the counter too much because that's a really murky area. But when you think of more complex systems, human factors is often already integrated somehow in the much earlier stages. But where the dangers in forgetting us or thinking of us as an afterthought often come in is in the world of simple devices. Wait, when you think, you, the manufacturer, when I say you, I mean manufacturer, developer, when you think something is so simple, right? That, well, I've never seen a surgeon not do that. I've never seen a surgeon not know that that's the port for XYZ. Oh, really? Okay, let's put it to the test, right? And the thing is, I've been doing this for 20 years. I have never been in a usability test where I did not sit there and have a moment of deer in the headlights where I go, I did not even think somebody could do that with that device. Which not speaks to any negative component or characteristic or anything about the user. It literally just means all of our brains work differently.
Yep.
All of our thinking works differently. We all have our own brought with mental models. We all transfer knowledge. We all think of things in a societal sense. We have groupthink. Yeah, there's often, we can use the concept of red is stop, green is go, right? But you also have to think of like, that's us. That's us when I say US. You go to a different country, they might think of that differently, right? So each human comes with so many factors in the background in their thinking that sometimes you can't even think of all the things that somebody could do, quote unquote, wrong with something. And I really say quote unquote wrong because sometimes it's just different.
Right.
But that's where like this whole concept of like, it's not just DOR, it can be a simple device, and that's where we're often lost. And what surprisingly then happens is it's not so much that there's a complete disconnect. Sometimes it's something very tiny that leads to the user not having an overall comprehensive enough understanding of the device. And then that little bit leads them to consistent misuse or consistent errors with it, right? And that then leads to the failure of the success of the product.
You're describing the words that jump into my mind is curse of knowledge. And as the manufacturer, as the sales team, you are all cursed with knowledge that comes with the manufacturing of this device and everything behind it. The end user is kind of in a vacuum away from that curse, and they're going to bring their own curse of knowledge that comes from a different perspective. They're seeing something that they're putting that own view on it, and sometimes it doesn't translate. It's actually something that I can mentally connect with very well, because the company that sponsors this podcast, Trackable Med, does direct to consumer marketing for patient education. And what the company does is uncovers bias barriers in why people don't seek treatment, which is a narrative outside of a doctor's office. And that narrative impacts a human's behavior. And if you're not aware of it, it doesn't matter what you put in front of that person if it's not taking care of a bias that they have. And it's the same thing, not mechanical, right? It's a curse of knowledge that doesn't translate because you haven't taken into account the narrative that's existing outside of your own curse of knowledge. I don't know if any of that made sense, but that's what I thought of when you walked through that.
Well, yeah, it makes sense. I'll give you a little bit of an extension on that. When you say the curse of knowledge, I see it, we often say my user. We often hear my users, our users, right? From marketing teams, often product teams. And they get their feedback often from sales reps. And that feedback is split. I can't give a statistic. I'm just going to go ahead and guesstimate from my experience. 70 to 30 on perception versus actual performance. Okay. So the feedback that they're providing is heavily biased by user perception, user feelings, user wants. But users often don't verbalize their wants with their actual aligned needs. So when I say that, I mean, you can put a product in front of somebody and they can perceive it as one thing, and they can think of it as one thing, and they use it as one thing, and then they'll use it. And then you'll ask them afterwards, how was that? Oh, fine. In your observation, you have now seen they completely misused it. They have no clue what they're doing with it in worst case scenarios. And they're just using transfer knowledge, meaning they have used something similar or they've worked in that environment so long that they're just using their general knowledge of that environment, and they're thinking, well, this goes there, and this is this, and this is this, and this is that. So I'm going to use it this way. And I got the let's just take a pre-filled syringe or something like that. And I got the liquid out and it went into the patient. Done.
Right.
Perfect.
It reminds me of when I see someone using a paring knife to chop an onion. Drives me nuts. Yes, it's a knife. Use the chef's knife.
Okay. You better never watch me cook then. But that's where the culprit lies, right? So you have to think of it that way. The sales rep often hears what the user wants. Those thoughts, those wishes, those wants are often not aligned with what they actually need. And when we, the human factors researcher, actually get the chance to observe users in their natural environment, where there is an issue to be solved, where there's a problem, and we're supposed to provide something that is a solution to that problem, which in that sense a medical device is, right? Whether it is a tool to do a procedure that fixes a problem, or whether it is the device itself is the solution to a problem, or a product, a combination product that has a drug delivery device can be a solution to a problem, disease in this state. That is where the connection is. When we can see something, we can analyze and we can say, that's where the culprit is. That's what you're going to have to include. And that's actually what your device is supposed to do. And instead, what you often get from marketing teams and sales teams are a feature-itis wish list, right? Well, we could also do that. Oh, we've heard from this doctor. Well, if this could do this too, and if that could do that too, and if this, okay, well, if they could switch the imaging from here to here, and if they, okay, stop. Was that one person who wanted that? One out of how many? Did you calculate the power of your population? Like, do you know how many people are actually going to use this? So there's this everlasting 80-20 rule that kind of goes into all of our lives. I think everybody's kind of familiar with the 80-20 rule, right? Mm-hmm. If you get 80% out of something, that's awesome. But we're human. So we're always chasing for the 20% too, right? We want also the other 20%. Now, then we trade for something that only has the 20%. Now we're missing the 80%, right? And now we're like, oh, I wish we would have stayed with that, right? So that's where kind of we come in. We're like, okay, well, let's look at the population and let's try to provide something that at least 80% out of the population can use in a real good sense. And everybody's going to kill me for saying the 80% because we don't go by percentages, but I'm just trying to give a more common known thing to apply to your thinking when you think of like how you want to develop something. You don't want to develop it for the 20%, right? And so that's kind of where we come in. And the danger of us in being engaged too late is when you then go through development in the development stages and you do, let's say you've already done, let's take a drug delivery device. Let's say you've already done your molding. Now you have molds. Now nobody wants to change those. Those are expensive. You've already produced your molds. Like, that's where we should have been there before you did that. We should have been involved when you have prototypes that were being, 3D printed and not molded, right?
Do you think people are scared to bring you in that early because they think you're going to slow them down too much? Or do you think that they are just not thinking about it? Like, is it purposeful, let's wait on that? Or is it more just unaware?
I think there's many factors. I think there is, scared is, I don't know, if you're scared in R&D, you shouldn't be working in R&D. But, I mean, you're always going to find issues in R&D. But I think it's more a combination of budget. They don't like spending money on us. Time, right? They don't like pushing timelines. They don't like for us to come in and say, well, you're not where you think you are, right? Mm-hmm. And it's also the thing you've mentioned is unawareness is also a big factor. a lot of C-suite members don't even know what human factors is. They don't even know that that is a part of their R&D development. They don't even know that that is a part that is now so highly correlated to your approval process that it only jumps on their radar when their submission is in and they get a letter back and the FDA says, by the way, where is XYZ? And it has to do with your human factors, right? But then there's also the another thing is also not just the unawareness and the money factor and the timeline factor, but it's also kind of I don't know how to say it nicely. It's also an ego factor, right? They think they already know what they're doing. They think they've already achieved what they're trying to achieve. They don't think there could possibly be anything wrong with their design. They don't think there's possibly anything you could add value to it, right? That's where often also the culprit is. So there's many more factors. There are organizational challenges, right? There's structure challenges. We often are also a part of a development team, and then we also are like embedded into other groups where we don't have our own authority. So we become a subpart of a subgroup of a group. And so we have no leader, we have no authority, we have no decision-making, power. And that's another thing that is often overlooked in organizations. I think organizations in general, when it comes to medical device development, whether it is in the pharmaceutical industry or medtech purely, human factors people should have a seat at the table just like anybody else. The engineering manager, the quality manager, the safety manager, the risk management team, the regulatory team, everybody has a seat at the table. Human factors is often considered a part of engineering, a part of research, right? But we should sit at the table just like anybody else and have veto ability just like anybody else. And I think that's where the unawareness to the C-suite often comes in, because they don't see the director of human factors in any of the meetings, right? Or the VP of human factors. They don't see those people, right? It's title. I mean, titles mean nothing, but that's kind of what it is.
Let's look at the outcome of pulling human factors in early and effectively. What really gets me excited about conversations we've had in the past, and where I could see this having massive benefit to a lot of the folks on the commercial side of the organization, is the intrinsic strategic value that can be created when human factors is thought of early on as a competitive advantage, much less not just an afterthought and something you have to do for regulation. So you talked about the ability to create value, create a need, like really solve a need versus wants. And what that sounds like to me is creating value. So when you're looking for strategic advantage to be able to sell into a marketplace when it's time to actually drive demand, you need strategic value to separate yourselves from every other Tom, Dick, and Harry out there. It sounds like this is a big component of really zeroing in on the need of a problem, whatever that problem is, in a way to engineer towards that earlier in the process. Am I way off base?
No. So this is where it gets interesting, because often, I mean, you can think of the ideal, like the perfect, the wonderful world where, something happens and some wunderkind comes up with this amazing invention, and now, patients like get to do XYZ, right? But it's always, human factors is always the advocate for the patient, the user, right? We're the advocates for the people who are actually going to use, and then the patient quality of life, right? But if you look at it from a strategic point, right? A lot of medical devices are also developed because XYZ product on the market has this and it's providing that, and you now want a competitive advantage. So you're upgrading your product, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is you want to pull, you want to share the market, you want a piece of that, right? and you want a big chunk of it. Well, then why are you developing something that is exactly the same? Because here's the thing. Every device on the market, I can guarantee you, you can put every device on the market and you will find one thing that wasn't thought of in the R&D process, right? And that little thing becomes a thing where you could have competitive advantage. So instead of just reproducing something and filing a 510K, right? You can still file a 510K, but you can change a couple of things, right? And you can address the little issues that that thing has, and now you have a competitive advantage, right? You can go as far as like you can do competitive testing. You can put you can put your product up against the other one, and you can do competitive usability testing, and you can see what performs better. When I say perform, I don't say perform what gives the best diagnosis. Of course, that would be your goal, but how did the user get there? How did they use your product? Was it more effectively, right? Was it safer? Was it quicker? Was it quicker is just one of the tangents. It could be anything, right? Was it simpler? Was it less this, less that, you know? Could they use it without user instructions? Could they use it by just looking at it? Did they have to read a manual? Like, there's a lot of things that come into play where you can get competitive advantage on the market and you can gain a huge market share. And that's where the sales reps come in. Like, I can guarantee you will find any sales rep listening to this will know of one story where they saw a product hit the market, right? That addressed something that your product didn't have, and now you're out, right?
Seeing it right now in the urology space.
You're out.
It's I love the call out on when someone witnesses, you know what, we can make this a little bit better, instead of reducing or limiting your thought around that being the only change. Beyond just improving because of what you're adding, how can you go and improve the existing product first? Because now it makes it a no-brainer when your sales team is in the field and I have one in each hand and one just feels better. And I go, gosh, I like it better.
I'll give you an example. This is my favorite example. And I have told the story so many times, and yet still I get the big eyes, the deer in the headlights look. And they go, what? So I was doing a research study and I was in, let's just call it a surgical environment. I don't really want to give away what this was about, but, and there was a product, and that product was used during surgery. So surgical fields. So you have, your sterile environment, your non-sterile environment, right? Mm-hmm. You have the circulating nurse who provides the things into the sterile environment. Now, let's just say this product had a packaging that's very typical for surgical environment where you have the outer foil on one side being transparent so you know what's in there, right? And you open it in a manner where it drops into the sterile field so it stays sterile, right? Okay, so this particular product, every time the scrub nurse or the person handing it into the sterile field would open it, it would rip on one side. So imagine opening a rectangular packaging that has a transparent foil on one side, and then let's just say white plastic film on the other side. And every time this particular person or this person opened it, it ripped on one side, meaning the foil would crack in, the device would lean forward and then drop to the floor, and now it's not sterile. So you have to pick another one, right? And you can do that once. Okay. Second time, you do it a second time, the surgeon will yell at you. Now, I'm not saying the surgeon is a mean person and they're yelling at the person. They're just going, forget it, use something else, because OR time is valuable time, mm-hmm. Right? So even though the surgeon prefers what you just had in your hand, they will go with the second product because it's easier to get into the field. Yep. And that particular product that I'm talking about where it kept ripping is where I was doing research on, and I was being told sales were down. And nobody could understand why, because it was a superior product. It was the product. It was the device. And nobody could understand why the sales were down. And at first I didn't see it either. It took me a couple of rounds. And then I interviewed, and you develop a relationship as a researcher with these people, right? You talk on their breaks, and you hang out in the waiting OR space, right? In the view room of these surgical environments. And I ended up just chatting with the nurses and hearing their, this and that. And they're like, I'm so frustrated every time this thing rips. And I'm like, is that why you're not, like, can you tell me more about that? And they would tell me. So coming to find out, the product wasn't the issue. The material was the issue, the packaging. And coming to find out, after I did a little digging, I found out that they changed materials of the plastic about 12 months earlier to a different supplier, because the supplier provided the quote unquote same material for a little less in cost. So this is human factors. People think that has nothing to do with human factors. No, that is human factors. You are changing. That is what the interface is. The packaging is a part of the interface. So you just went ahead and changed your product without even thinking about it, without testing it, put it on the market, and then you're surprised because your sales went down. And that is where human factors comes in. And any sales rep would tell you that, but the sales rep can't see what the researcher sees.
Yep.
And that's the problem. All the sales rep sees is that they're not using it. But they can only talk to the surgeon, and the surgeon will tell them that they prefer it. So it makes no sense to them. And the researcher will go beyond that and go, wait, what just happened there? Let me just take a quicker, deeper look at that. And that's where we come into play. And that's why I say you can have a competitive advantage by simply fixing something as simple as a 12-cent material change. And that's it.
Well, and there's no chance that leadership of that company wouldn't want to go back in time and redo that idea, knowing what they know now. And so I'm really glad that you told that story, because that really brings it home from just a simple spot. Heidi, I want to thank you so much for joining us today on the podcast. In the show notes, we'll add a link to your website. And then is it okay if I put the link to your LinkedIn as well for people to reach out to you if they want to chat with you?
Sure.
Great. Appreciate it. And those listeners out there, go to medicalsalesaccelerator.com. And when you do so, sign up for the email so you know about upcoming episodes, download the resource so that it can help you communicate better with your customers. And you can also submit guest ideas or topics.
If you learned something or found value in today's episode, I want you to do a few things for us. Leave a review, drop some stars. We love those 5 stars. Subscribe to the podcast. And finally, go to the box with an arrow at the top, send it to your friends, your family, your colleagues, your mama and your daddy. We greatly appreciate it. Heidi, once again, thank you. Make it a great week, everybody.